The thing about being a whiskey enthusiast is you will start collecting more and more whiskey. And then some of that whiskey won't get opened, or, you'll take a while to get round to those individual bottles. So how do you make sure that when you do open those bottles, and even if it's like 5 or 10 years away, that the bottles will still taste just as good as when you bought them? How do you preserve your whiskey? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. So grab a dram, grab a seat, and let's... Welcome First Fill, I'm Phil, and I'm going to fill you in about whiskey. So the good news about whiskey can actually last quite a long time compared to, say, wine. But that's if you store it correctly. And one of the ways you can store it correctly is by having it upright. And this kind of goes against a lot of assumptions people have. People assume, well, the way to age alcohol is to have it on its side, and that's only really true for wine. So here we are, we've got the Barolo 2012, which is from the Nebbiolo grape, and this wine is known for being able to be aged for a very long time, up to 30 years. I store this wine on its side, and the reason you like to store it on its side, and the reason, if you've ever been to a wine cellar or a vineyard where they're storing all their wines and aging them, you'll generally see all the wines lined up on their side, and that's because of the cork, to keep the cork moist. And if it's not moist, then the cork can crack, which can then lead to air going through the cork, oxidizing the wine, and then making the wine go off, basically turning the wine into vinegar over time. And that's not something you want with wine. Whereas with whiskey, if you store this on its side, it's a little bit different because of the alcohol content. And with that high percentage alcohol at 46%, it's going to basically, the cork's not going to be able to withstand that onslaught of power and alcohol strength, and that's just going to disintegrate that cork, and that will break down, and it will do the same thing. It will let air in, and then it will oxidize your whiskey. So just a side note about that as well, if you've got a whiskey, a nice whiskey that you're tending to keep for quite a few years, it might be a good idea for just a couple times a year to put it horizontally so that it can keep that cork moist, in the same way what I was just talking about with the wine, just so it doesn't crack and dry out over time, letting that oxygen in. And also, when you do eventually open it, you don't want the cork to kind of disintegrate. Now, the thing is, this is not going to happen as fast with wine going off when the oxygen does get in. You've got a decent window there with whiskey, but even still, if you've got air getting through over an entire year, that's going to make a difference to your whiskey, and it's going to probably change the flavor unfavorably to actually how you want the flavor to be. And another way you can prevent this is just with parafilm around the top, or Glad wrap, or whatever, just to make sure that seal is very tight and just that there's no oxygen that's going to get in. So the next part of this video, I want to go through the 3 key aspects about keeping your whiskey, and that's temperature, that's air, and that's light. So the first one we're going to look at is the temperature. Some of you are going to have it easier than others. If you're in a country where between summer and winter the temperature is quite similar, you got mild summers and you got mild winters, it's going to be a lot easier for you. Whereas if you've got extreme temperature changes and it's going from -5 to 35, that's when you've got to think about where you're storing your whiskey. Because what will happen with a change of temperature is it will expand that whiskey, and then it will retract and expand. And that's why they often leave a little gap of air in every bottle of whiskey, because of that process. So what you want to do with your whiskey is try and keep it in a place in your house where it has the most consistent temperature. So generally this is probably the room that, it's not the same room as your heat pump, when it's going off and on and off and on, heating up and cooling down, heating up and cooling down. It's probably not what you want. So, put it in the room that gets the least amount of change. Maybe it's the room furthest away from your heat pump or your fire, so it's getting that heat last, so it's a much slower kind of progression of temperature. Or maybe that's under your house. It might be a bit colder than the rest of the house, but at least that temperature is going to be consistent. So for me, I keep it in this office. It's the furthest away from the heat pump, which is on the other side of the house. So it's the last room to get the heat coming through, so it has the least amount of kind of change. With a professional cellar, obviously, that's a part of your house that's kind of intended for this process. But most people don't have that. I don't have that. You just got to look at where you can store it best. So the next thing to watch out for is sunlight. Now sunlight can break down the alcohol in the whiskey, it can break down those esters, and it can just really ruin your whiskey as well. You've got a nice sunny kitchen and your whiskey's sitting there on the windowsill. You know, it's probably not the best idea. What you want to do really is you want to kind of mimic the cellar, somewhere that's consistent with its temperature, somewhere where the sunlight can't get in. You know, you don't actually need a cellar. This can just be in, you know, which bedroom in your house gets the least amount of light. That might be the place to put it. You can make sure that there's no sunlight getting into that bottle and doing damage to those tasty, tasty molecules in there that are going to give you a very tasty whiskey. So the next thing is air, and air is basically the oxidation process of your whiskey. Now, it's not going to oxidize as fast as an open bottle of wine. You know, an open bottle of wine can go off in a day, whereas they say an open bottle of whiskey with 2/3 in it can last up to a year. But as you drink more and more whiskey, and as it gets down to just a tiny tipple at the bottom, that oxidation process is going to speed up. It could be a month before it starts going flat. It starts losing that flavor, it starts losing that complexity, and the oxidation onslaught will start attacking your whiskey. So what do you do about that? Well, there's two things you can do. One is bring your mates around, finish off your bottle, have a good night. If you're Nigel No Friends, you might want to put it into a little container, or if you just want to save it for another time, when we can start to travel again and see a friend from the other side of the world who might come to visit, you know, we can put it into a smaller bottle, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So here we've got a jar, and we've got sort of 100 ml kind of little bottle, and I'm not sure how much this is, a bit more, which we can put our whiskey into. And a good thing about this is that you're reducing the percentage of oxygen to whiskey content. So your whiskey's just going to last that little bit longer. Look, it's not as pretty as having a nice bottle on the shelf, but you know, it's going to taste better. Ardbeg, which is very low. Let's put this into this little bottle. I'm just going to use my pourer helper. There we go. Get all those last drops. Beautiful. And actually not as much as I thought was in that bottle. So we only got sort of 40 mils left. But that's going to make your Ardbeg last a lot longer than keeping it in the big 700 ml bottle. And then what I like to do is just to write some notes about the whiskey, what it was and when you bottled it. Ardbeg 10. I'm shooting this video on the 7th of October. There we go. That's going to slow down the oxidation process of this Ardbeg 10, so we can enjoy this, you know, in a few months' time. And actually, side note, there's actually one other option you can do with your little bit leftover whiskey, and that's having an infinity bottle. With an infinity bottle, you're kind of pooling all the whiskies that you've had over time into a kind of a new malt, and I'll just show you mine. So currently I'm using this bottle of the Port Charlotte Isla as my infinity bottle, and in this bottle is actually all sorts of whiskies, and it's actually getting a bit low. I'm probably drinking too much of it because I quite like the profile of it at the moment, so it's going down quite quick, so I might put this into a smaller bottle. But basically we've got, yeah, it's got bourbon flavors, it's got sherry flavors, it's got a little bit of smoky flavors. You got to be a bit careful how much smoke you put in because it can overpower the rest of the flavors in there. Yeah, it's got malty flavors. So that's another thing you can do. If you don't want to store it into a little bottle, put it into an infinity bottle and create a whole new whiskey. Let's just have a taste of that. Yeah, that's still lovely. Getting that sort of caramelly from the bourbon. Aftertaste, you're getting a lot more of the sherry, kind of dried fruit notes. A slight undertone of smoke as well. And it's got sort of like the mid palate is quite similar to like the Lafroig. It's got this sort of oiliness to it. And it's got this real maltiness as well. There's a few whiskies I put in it, like the Glenlivet and I think the Balvenie Double Water's in here. So it's sort of like a malty kind of barley sugar note. Lovely whiskey. Now I just want to address one question that I've had a few people ask me, and that is, can you age your whiskey? Like, can you age it when it's in the bottle like you can with this Barolo wine? With 30 years time, this will come out probably as a better wine. And the answer is no, you can't. If you've got a 12-year-old bottle of whiskey, you age it 100 years, it will pretty much be a 12-year-old whiskey when you drink it. The aging process in a whiskey happens in the cask. it doesn't happen in the bottle, and that's because of the higher alcoholic content. So that's why you don't need to feel bad about opening even a younger whiskey like a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or something with a no age statement too early, because just keeping it on your shelf is not going to make it any better. Whiskey aging happens in the cask. It doesn't happen in the bottle. So grab your bottle of whiskey, open your bottle of whiskey, and enjoy it with some friends. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it, subscribe, hit the bell, but above all, make sure you share and enjoy. Beauty.